From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome. It's September 12th, 2018. We're here at the Library of Congress. My name is Steve Winick. I'm the editor in the American Folklife Center, and I'm here with our guest, John McCutcheon. And
Thanks.
John is going to be performing a concert tonight in the Coolidge Auditorium. And in the meantime, we're going to ask him some great questions about his life and his career.
Great. Let's go.
So, John, let's begin with the sort of typical question, your early life and how you got interested in all this music stuff.
Well, I was born and raised in northern Wisconsin, a little town called Wausau, Wisconsin, and was interested in music in general, the way young kids are. But the seminal moment happened actually not far from here. I wasn't there, but my mother, when I was 11 years old, was watching television in the middle of the day, and my mother didn't watch television, period. And here she was in the middle of the day. Who knew there was television in the middle of the day? And she said, "Here, come over here and watch this with me." And I was the eldest of her 9 children, so I was and my father was a traveling salesman, so I guess I was the closest to adult companionship that she had.
Mm-hmm.
And what she was watching was the March on Washington. And it was, as you probably know, the first thing in our nation's history broadcast live on every channel, which at that time meant 3.
Right.
And it was an astonishing thing to watch. And the takeaway of that for me, it was my introduction to folk music. I'd never heard of folk music before. And there was Joan Baez and Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul, and Mary singing what my mother told me were folk songs. Mm-hmm. And I recognized them because they were all original songs that they sang. Well, there was Marian Anderson and Mahalia Jackson, which was a religious experience for a kid from Wisconsin. But I recognized this music as something that was deep and potent, but also something that was connected to contemporary issues as well. This being the most contemporary issue, was on the news every night. And my best friend was watching at the same time, and the next day we saw one another and said, "Did you see that? What was that?" And we started talking about this music that we knew nothing about, but that had really moved us. And we started listening to it. It was at a time, this was 1963, you could hear folk music on the radio. Mm-hmm. It was on television. And it was, I immediately went for the sort of more rustic sound. I mean, a few years later, I got a guitar because my best friend got a guitar for his birthday. And I went down to the library, and the only book in the library that could teach me guitar chords was Woody Guthrie folk songs. And I didn't know who Woody Guthrie was. Mm-hmm. I was 14. I'd sung his songs in school. Every American kid grows up singing Woody Guthrie songs. But they never tell you who writes those songs. So I opened it up, and here's a page of chord grids. I thought, great, I know what these are. And here's a whole bunch of songs. And so my first real heavy-duty exposure to learning this music was Woody Guthrie, mm-hmm. who was firmly planted in traditional roots, built his writing firmly on those roots. And what it meant is I completely missed the sort of button-down collegiate ed of folk music. Right. I didn't know for 5 more years that, for instance, that the Kingston Trio existed. I was right in the flannel shirt and work boot world. It was Woody, and from there it was Pete Seeger, and somebody gave me a Bob Dylan album, and I could tell what well he drank from. Mm-hmm. So it began that crooked road that took me right down into one day saying, I want to play the banjo.
Interesting. So one of the things that you mentioned that was interesting was that these were all people on TV doing folk music. They were all doing, as you said, original songs.
Original stuff.
So that sort of opens up that question of the connection between traditional folk music and the original songs that are called folk songs by a lot of Americans. What's your take on that?
Well, I fell prey to that as well. I mean, I knew that this was somehow, you know, when Pete Seeger sang John Henry, a broadside, uh, and then he sang, you know, Who Killed Davy Moore.
Right.
They were somehow connected. They were built on the same matrix. And so I thought, well, I'm going to write songs. Look at this whole. I finally found out who Woody Guthrie was. Oh, these are all original songs. I'm gonna write songs too, and I did. And I wrote really awful songs, like you do when you start off. And they were all the more awful because of the traditional songs I knew that had been worn smooth and beautiful on thousands of tongues before mine. And
so they were awful by comparison.
Oh, they were awful. They were awful by themselves.
Yeah.
My best friend, the guitar guy, who both started off together, he's got a tape of all those songs, which he claims is going to go right up on YouTube if we ever have a serious falling out. So, you know, what I did when I got to banjo world, you know, I was going to a little college in northern Minnesota, St. John's University, and it was at a time when they were pretty freewheeling about giving people independent studies. And I went to my advisor and I said, I'm going off the deep end on this banjo thing, and I can tell I'm heading for not being in college anymore. And is there a way we can make this work? Can I get credit? I need to be around banjo players.
Right.
And Guy Carawan had come to our college, and I was designated his host because I was the only kid in the college who knew who he was. And then I met Pete Seeger later on in the year, and both of them said, you just got to go south. If you want to learn to play the banjo, you got to go down where it's part of the meat and potatoes of people's daily diet. So I convinced my advisor to let me do a 3-month independent study of traveling around the Appalachians. I didn't own a car. I hitchhiked.
Mm-hmm.
And so there I was at the side of the road with a banjo and a backpack, and it was like a free bus ride.
Wow.
You know, people would pick me up and they'd say, you play that thing? And I learned to say, I play at it. And they'd say, well, play me something. And we'd be driving along in a truck or something, and I'd take it out and play something. And they'd say, oh, you play that old style. And people called it alternately frailing and whacking and knockdown and claw hammer and old time. And they would say, well, yeah, that's like my Uncle Beechard plays. Mm-hmm. And I'd say, well, where's Uncle Beechard live? And they'd say, well, he's right up here. And I guess the prospect of seeing 2 banjo players was enough to derail people's plans for the day. And then it was, you know, you'd meet one person, and that one person would say, hey, come on over, we're going to have a party. And eventually, you know, 3 months into this 3-month independent study, I knew I was just figuring out how to do this. Because, you know, you come out of academia and you're in a little room,
right?
And a professional teacher comes in armed with a pedagogy that is sequential or whatever, and to the exclusion of everything else, you study, you know, late 18th century French literature. And then you go to another room and you do something entirely focused and different. With this, it was about as unacademic as possible. They weren't teachers. They didn't have a pedagogy for me. I just had to learn how to learn traditionally. Mm-hmm. I had to learn how to listen and remember and duplicate and be quiet and pay attention and hang around the fringes. And I discovered quite later that I was the beneficiary of a cultural phenomenon that I didn't recognize at the time. I was part of the first generation of kids who grew up in that part of the world who was totally immersed in the radio. Mm-hmm. And they had all kinds of stuff coming in, all kinds of music, and the kids of the people that I was just happening upon, in general, were not interested in learning that music. They wanted to learn this music, the popular stuff,
Right.
the stuff that would give them, possibilities. And there was the radio, there were roads, there were jobs in cities elsewhere, and I end up knocking on someone's door unwittingly, saying, "I'm from 1,000 miles away, and I'd like to learn this music." So I became the unwitting beneficiary of this cultural phenomenon, and you know, it didn't take me long to fall in love with everything about the region. The people, the music, the land, the stuff that was just percolating up in every, whether it be the reform of the mine workers union or popular protest against strip mining, what they call mountaintop removal now. Land rights issues, water issues, and every little community seemed to have this kind of stuff in this. So there was a lot of energy everywhere. I thought I was going down to learn how to play the banjo, but what I found was the most interesting thing, and has been my study since that time, is how music functions as a fundamental rather than an ornamental part of community life. That's what was really interesting to me. And if I learned some fiddle or hammer dulcimer or a story or a song or a dance or a hymn at the same time, wonderful. But if I walked away and just got to go to a pie supper or go to an old regular Baptist meeting or whatever, it was a treat.
Great. So were you recording all of this at the time, or?
At first, at the very first, I wasn't. And then as I started to accumulate contacts and context, I realized that I should get some of this down. I became friends with the people at Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and they had good recording equipment, Nagras and Stellavoxes and stuff like that, that I was able to. And I contacted the Folklife Center. Joe Hickerson was the head archivist at the time, and he and I have been, we're still friends. I still see him every time I go to Portland. But they arranged to give me free reel-to-reel tape. And so I started off doing it that way. And I got really dissatisfied with reel-to-reel tape. And I remember Mike Seeger and I would have lots of discussions about high-quality cassette recordings, just because it was less obtrusive. You could do more. It could be longer. And I can't tell you how many times I would watch someone singing or playing something and they're watching the reels go around, and it just felt like it was altering the whole atmosphere. And I was all about, I was really reluctant to it was sort of like asking someone if I could kiss their daughter. Excuse me, I know I think I've put my time in now. One funny story, one of the traditional musicians that I was the closest to was a fellow named Isaac David Stamper, I.D. Stamper, just the most stunning mountain dulcimer player I've ever met. A blues mountain dulcimer player from Letcher, originally from Searcy, Arkansas, but his family moved up to Letcher County, Kentucky. And I met him at a festival, and we agreed to meet at his house. So I went to his house, and after I was there for about 3 hours, I said, "Mr. Stamper, my memory is just not that good, and I really love your music, and would you mind if I went out to my car and brought in my tape recorder and taped some of your stuff? I'll be happy to make a copy for you and your family." And he said, "I'm so glad you asked. Can I tape some of your music as well?"
That's a nice outcome.
Yeah, it's better than some that's been around there. I heard lots of stories through the years. Oh, somebody taped me and made a record and made $1 million off it, and there was no way of dissuading people of that.
Well,
So I was hesitant to do it. A part of it was the immediacy, but I also knew that I was given incredible, intimate access to this stuff. And for the longest time, I believed, like a lot of people did, and some do, that this is dying out. That wasn't my experience at all. And it was vibrant and evolving, and it's sort of like, can I tape you? You know, I didn't meet people who wanted me to be a human tape recorder,
Right.
mimicking what they played. These were musicians. They were interested in being musicians together. They wanted to see, well, how do you play? Let's play something together. No, I don't care if you can play just like me.
Right.
You know.
No,
And that's what I tried to
sense, yeah.
do at first, and but I was young and stupid, and I learned, and now I'm old and stupid.
Well, your recordings of ID Stamper are here in the library, or
Yes.
copies of them, and within that collection, we also have some other interesting folks that you interacted with and recorded at that time. And I wonder if you'd mind telling us a little bit about some of them.
Sure.
Starting with Peanut Cantrell.
Peanut Cantrell was from McMinnville, Tennessee. He was one of the very few hammer dulcimer players in the South, and as a hammer, when someone gave me a hammer dulcimer, she built it. She said, "Here, I just wanted to build it. I don't want to play it. You play a lot of instruments. You could probably play this." And I started to, but I felt really ungrounded because of all the instruments I played. I had really sought out people who'd played all their lives. I felt like they gave a kind of, gravity and depth that I didn't find I couldn't afford to take lessons. But when it came to the hammer dulcimer, I couldn't find anybody who was a traditional player. I went up to West Virginia and met with Russell Fluharty, and Whirly Gardner was up in the Morgantown area. And I never made it up to meet Chet Parker up in Michigan. So I happened to be out at some fiddle convention in McMinnville, and I decided I was going to get up on stage and play the hammer dulcimer, and somebody came over to me and said, "You know Peanut Cantrell?" And so I went over to his house, and it was the only time we met. He died shortly thereafter. But it was so exciting for me because by this time I'd actually been to Europe and traveled around and found hammer dulcimer type players over there. To find someone who with an American repertoire.
Yeah.
And Peanut was a perfect name for him. He was a little short guy and lovely man.
So how did he play? I mean,
it was very simple type stuff. I approached the dulcimer as a drum because I got sticks in my hand, and all of a sudden I was 8 years old, beating on the table with pencils. So I was, one of the things I'm so grateful for is that I went into this whole experiment with a completely open slate. I didn't, when I went south, I was raised on the Beverly Hillbillies and Little Abner and Snuffy Smith and all that crap, just like everybody else. But luckily, somehow, I didn't believe any of it, and everything was information. So with Peanut, I had no preconceptions of what he was going to do. It was just like, let's go, just play. But it was, I have fewer recordings of him than I would have liked. But I was really grateful that I had an opportunity to see him.
And it's rare that anyone recorded traditional hammer dulcimer playing in the South anyway. So it's great that you did get those recordings. Yeah.
Well, that's one of it's sort of like being that 20-year-old kid with a banjo and a backpack. I had a signal out there. This is what I do. Yeah. So when someone saw me play the hammer dulcimer, the first time I ever played the dulcimer, I was at Bascom Lamar Lunsford's Mountain Music and Dance Festival in Asheville, and I was playing some tunes, and I'd been playing for 24 hours. But I knew how to find fiddle tunes on it, and this woman said, "I've never seen anybody play the bureau before." So it was a pretty unusual instrument. So when I did, people would come up and say, "Well, you know about so-and-so."
Right. Great. Well, another person in that collection is Cass Wallen,
Oh.
who's kind of better known, I suppose. But what was your experience of working with him?
I stumbled into Sodom, which is Sodom Laurel. They're the three Laurels: Shelton Laurel, Sodom Laurel, and Big Laurel, up in Madison County, North Carolina. Many years ago, the Morris brothers from West Virginia, John and Dave Morris, got a grant from the Ford Foundation to put on some community festivals around the Appalachian South, and one of them was in Sodom. And I heard about it. I was probably 20, 21 years old, and I had heard some of the Folkways records of people like Dillard Chandler.
Right.
So I went up to this festival, and it was, Sodom was properly named. I mean, there was a shooting and a knifing, and people would come around and say, "Stay in your tents." But the music was just fantastic, and Kaz, again, was a short fella, very expressive, and he would plant himself when he would sing, and he would motion with his arms, "Where will I shelter my sheep tonight?" And he had that very adenoidal kind of voice, and just an incredible repertoire and a wicked sense of humor. Once you got to know him, and his wife would talk the entire time that he was singing, which is memorialized in the collection. But he sang old ballads, and he was part of that whole Dellie Norton, Dillard Chandler, Aubrey Ramsey group up there, and Sheila K. Adams by extension, who was Dellie Norton's granddaughter, and who I met that weekend. Sheila K. and I are about the same age, and we were both young, banjo-struck young people who just wanted to eat, breathe, and play traditional music. And I remember we sat up most of that evening, and then she took me up to see Dellie, who I think is the unsung star of that whole clan up there. I mean, her singing is just some of my favorite in the world. But Cass, I'm going to be singing some of Cass's stuff tonight.
All right. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think Sheila would agree with you too about Dellie. She talks about her.
Yeah.
So one more person in that collection is sort of a separate tradition, Michael Kennedy.
I met Michael Kennedy through my friend Malcolm Dalglish, who's a beautiful hammer dulcimer player. He was, when I started playing, I was living in the Knoxville area, and Malcolm was living in the Cincinnati area. And because there weren't very many hammer dulcimer players in the world at that time, we glommed onto one another and just burned up I-75 going back and forth between Knoxville and Cincinnati almost every weekend if we could. And Malcolm was particularly taken with Irish traditional music. And he met this fellow, Michael J. Kennedy, who was a melodeon player, an Irish national, immigrant to this country, and he was living in Covington, Kentucky, which is right across the Ohio River from Cincinnati. And he and his musical partner, Gray Larson, excuse me, I just hit the mic. He and his musical partner, Gray Larson, would take me over to Michael Kennedy's house. And I had, by that time, started to organize some of my field recordings into albums for June Apple Records, which was a nascent record company that was a division of Appleshop. And had gotten a small grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, where Alan Jabor was the head of what was it called? Folk arts or something.
Folk and traditional arts.
But it was something even more broad earlier on. And I got a small grant to put some recordings together and organize them into LPs. And so I got together at a radio station in Cincinnati with Michael, and he wanted to do it very formally. You probably, people who listen to it, he would announce what he was going. This is this tune, and then he would play it, and he wanted people to clap at the end, which was problematic because after 2 or 3 hours, it was sort of like, yeah. And I'm running the tape recorder and clapping, going, "Come on, guys, be a little more enthusiastic." And there's 4 of us in the room. So, but he was a lovely man, and he died. When did he die? But I remember I was passing through, and he was in a hospice in a hospital, and I went. Malcolm and I went by, and played him some tunes. It would turn out to be the night before he died, and Malcolm called me the next day to tell me, and I thought, I hope that's my fate. That some of my musical friends will come in and play something at my bedside. He was a beautiful man. He looked. It's funny. I saw his picture the other day, and I never asked him if he actually got a gig as Santa Claus, but he certainly had that look.
Excellent. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned before that these traditions, although we might have thought at one point they were dying out, they aren't really.
No.
But the individual people that you meet and record, they pass on, and so
as we all do and will.
Yeah.
And so there was a period of time when I got much more not aggressive. I got much more spent a lot more time doing field work and trying to figure out how to do it better all the time. I mentioned that Mike Seeger and I worked, there was a period of time for years when we were both, really we were experimenting with different high-end cassette recorders, which seems like an oxymoron. But there were actually Nakamichi had a 3-channel, it was a stereo and a mono, and I have some beautiful recordings, which I'll be sending up to the library, of this banjo player, Will Keyes, from Upper East Tennessee, from Gray, Tennessee, and he played in such a way, he lost the tip of his index finger in a sawmill accident, and as a child, so he learned to play the banjo in this very unusual 2-finger style where he could play all 5 strings with his index finger because it was short.
Right.
Relative to what his thumb was. And he sort of held the banjo out here, so the Nakamichi, for instance, allowed me to do a stereo miking out here and then put the 3rd mono mic actually pointed in the back of the banjo, and it's my favorite banjo recording I've ever heard because it's as though you're really inside the banjo. And for someone who plays, it's sort of like someone who plays the auto harp. They get to hear this orchestral sound, and to everybody out in front, it's sort of bring, 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 bring.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and then of course, DAT machines came, and it's funny. I remember I was thinking of this today, knowing that we were going to talk. I happened to be coming back from Nicaragua, where I had been doing a bunch of field recording. This is in 1980, mid-80s. And I was waiting in baggage claim, and up walks Flawn Williams, who at that time, an old friend of mine, who at that time was working at NPR. And we're saying, "Oh, so where have you been?" I said, "I've just come back from 3 weeks in Nicaragua. I'm waiting for my suitcases of tapes." He said, "Yes, I just went off for NPR to Vietnam, and I've got 100 hours." And I said, "I do too. Mine is in 3 suitcases." And he said, "Mine is in the shoebox under my arm here." And I said, "What?" He says, "This new technology, a little tiny DAT machine." So of course, I went out and got one, and it changed everything. It didn't have the hiss of a cassette, and again, it was even smaller than the smallest cassette machine, and it just made the recording experience for everybody much less obvious, which is what you want.
Right. And now, of course, the media size is negligible compared even to the equipment. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
everything's so small. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and but back then it was the Wild West.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I'm really grateful that I had access, and Bias Studios here in the area, Bill McElroy,
Right.
had a Nagra that I would rent from time to time. So I mean, I was grateful I had access, because there was a period of time I had a Wallensack,
Right.
you know, big,
Yeah.
big bear of a thing, and as you were like you were moving a television into somebody's
And the funny
house.
thing is, they called those things portable
Yes.
because they had handles on them.
Yes.
But yeah.
Well, you know, it's sort of like what's, you know, the original laptop computers
Right,
were
Right.
filled your whole lap.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. So, well, we've talked about a couple of the instruments you play, but the hammer dulcimer kind of stands out, being an unusual instrument,
right.
but also people consider you a master of this instrument. So you talked about your beginnings with the instrument, but how did you get further involved?
I had a girlfriend who took an instrument building class up in Elkins, West Virginia. And I went up to visit her at the end of this class, and she had built this thing called a hammer dulcimer. I'd heard about it, I'd seen Guy Carawan play it, and that was you know, I never thought I wanted to play it. But she said, here, I have this thing that I've built, and I've accomplished my goal.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you, and my birthday was nearby, she said, here, happy birthday.
Well, that was nice.
Yeah.
So, and what was her name? Just to...
Jude Odell,
Okay.
and she is a wonderful banjo player who lives up in, and a jeweler who lives up in Indianapolis. And it's you know, there are many different tunings, but the tuning that has sort of become dominant in American music now is very logical, and it was diatonically set up. And I was primarily a fiddle player at that time. It happens, you know. Banjo players discover the fiddle, and then they fall into the rabbit hole of the haired bow. And so I was just playing fiddle tunes. So I had an encyclopedia of fiddle tunes in my head, and I just started pecking them out. And I was, oh, okay, I know how this works. Plus, you can do rolls, and when I was a kid, I wanted to play the drums, and so this was like it was a string drum. Yeah. And so what I did as far as developing my playing on it, I mostly played fiddle tunes. But I was different from most other hammer dulcimer players that I was meeting, and they included people like Sam Rosetta and Paul Reisler, who played with Sam in the group Trapezoid, and Malcolm, different people who were all parts of ensembles. They had some kind of chordal foundation upon which they were playing, and it affected how they played. I was a soloist. I wasn't going to be in a band. I didn't want to be in a band. I was nice and mobile and portable, and it worked for me. So I had to figure out how to create some kind of harmonic foundation upon which to play, and it really. So I was playing these tunes and then trying to create an accompaniment at the same time, or at least an arrangement that didn't make people say, well, that'd be pretty good if you had a guitar player with him or something. But I was also looking for the traditional players. And I was frustrated enough that I knew of a fellow named David Kettlewell, who had done a book called All the Tunes That Ever There Were, which was a little mimeographed thing I got from Andy Spence. Talked about a bunch of dulcimer players throughout England and Ireland. So I said, I had the same feeling as when I opened that, Mountain Music of East Kentucky album that came into our college library. And there's a picture of Roscoe Holcomb on the front. And inside was directions. You know, here's where these people live. And I thought, okay, I'm going. I want to have some kind of traditional foundation for my playing. So I went over and met Bill Fell and Billy Bennington, and the absolute star was Jimmy Cooper. Just the most astonishingly versatile player. He played on the streets as a young man and just played all the kinds of tunes that you would expect a traditional Scottish player to play. Schottisches and strathspeys and hornpipes and jigs and reels, but he also played cha-chas and old parlor songs and accompanied singing, and it was like opening up a whole world, because prior to that it had been fiddle tunes. Then I started with ragtime piano pieces.
There's a certain logic to that.
Yes,
connection.
and then in the mid '70s, I discovered Turlough Carolyn and said, okay, well, I'm going to take harp music, which again there's a kind of logic to this. But I came back, and this is 1977 when I met Jimmy. I came back and I was playing at the Buffalo Folk Festival. And I didn't know my life was about to change. I was doing a hammer dulcimer workshop, and this young woman came up to me and says, you know, my dad plays the dulcimer. I said, really? He says, yeah, my dad and his two brothers and my great-grandfather, and yeah, it's a tradition in our family. And I said, I would love to meet your father. She said, oh, I'll bet he'd like to meet you. And so the day after the festival, I went over to her house, and there sat Paul Van Arsdale. And he changed everything. I mean, not only did he become one of my dear friends, but he was a guy who was the most musical dulcimer player I've ever met. He loved to play. In fact, I walked in, and there he was, sitting behind his dulcimer with his hammers in his hands. You know, like, come on, I don't want to know about your family. I don't want to make small talk. Let's just play. And he made everything he played sound like it was written for the dulcimer. And it was like a light going off. And I thought, this is what American hammer dulcimer music is. And he just passed away in March.
March, yeah.
And he at 97, and at 97, he was still the best hammer dulcimer player I've ever heard. He got more adventurous the older he got. When I met him, he was playing a dulcimer that his grandfather had built, and it was a fifth across the treble bridge, and then, like the Michigan players, an octave from the right-hand side of the treble bridge to the bass bridge. And it was a really funky instrument, and was held together with baling wire and Scotch tape. And he was very interested in my Rosetta instrument, because it was chromatic and eventually had dampers on it, and it was light, and it stayed in tune well. And so he ordered a Rosetta instrument, and Sam tweaked it here and there to make it even more chromatic. And then he was off to the races. Whenever you saw Paul after that, he was playing the most wild, chromatic, you know, let's substitute this B flat chord here for this, you know. And so he was really adventurous, loved music, loved musicians, and he was just, I don't know what my playing would have been like. And he was learning new tunes.
Was he trained as a musician? I
No.
mean, reading music and all that?
Oh, no, not at all. He learned to play from his maternal grandfather, a fellow by the name of Jesse Martin, who was a professional hammer dulcimer player. He played in movie houses.
In that Henry Ford era, when
He won the audition to be Henry Ford's hammer dulcimer player.
Interesting. Okay.
But Henry Ford very famously was a teetotaler, and Jesse Martin very famously
Not
was
so much.
not. So he won the audition, but never played. But so when he played in movie houses while they were changing the reels, and
Right.
and people who know what I'm talking about are officially old. Um, and then in his retirement, he moved in with his daughter and taught his grandsons, Phil, Paul, and Sterl, how to play. And Sterl was a fixture in sort of he played fiddle and dulcimer in the sort of Western New York bluegrass and folk music world. Phil, who built dulcimers, moved to Arkansas, and I actually have one of his dulcimers built after his grandfather's design. And Paul lived in North Tonawanda. Paul was a tool grinder for Bell Aircraft by trade, and then when it's funny. I was just playing at the Wheatlands Music Festival up near Traverse City, Michigan, this last weekend, and some people came up to me while I was there saying, "I remember when Paul Van Arsdale and you would come to the Everett, old time music, the Hammer Dulcimer convention, and Paul would be the first one up and the last one to bed. That he would wear everybody out in the jam sessions." And I attended several Van Arsdale family reunions where I got to hear the three brothers play together, which was just angelic.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in addition to playing all these instruments, you're also a well-known songwriter. And I wanted to ask you about writing for different instruments. I mean, do you write a song for a particular instrument, or what's your writing process like?
I tend to, the two instruments I write the most on are guitar and piano. And I switch back and forth and sometimes in the middle of writing something when I'll just say, I want to have, the guitar for me is very blockish, the way it's all set up, and the piano is very linear. And it's all about voice, but every now and again, I'll be writing something and I'll say, oh, this is a banjo piece. And to me, all these instruments are absolutely related. I mean, number one, I started playing all these instruments because I would be at some banjo player's house and a fiddle player would be there, and we would have the same vocabulary. And I remember the first time I ever played a fiddle, I was at a square dance in Benfield, Tennessee, and the fiddle player didn't show up. And I was used to playing the banjo, and somebody with their had a fiddle said, "Here, you can play this." And I said, "No, I can't." They said, "Well, the dance is 20 minutes long. You know what the notes are. By the end of this 20 minutes, I'll bet you'll be playing it." And they were right. I could play really badly this particular tune by the end of it. So it was, and so then you realize, oh, well, this is the same fingering as the mandolin, and a lot of it was just you're doing this with one hand and something completely unrelated with the other. So once you get this tapping your head and rubbing your belly, all that is to say that I look at these as having a great big, really expensive toolbox. And when I'm writing something, sometimes I will write it on the guitar and they'll say, no, it doesn't belong there. Or what would it be like? How would this change? And sometimes it's an atmospheric thing. A banjo gives it a different. Wade Ward, one of my favorite musicians from down in Independence, Virginia, had this beautiful way of talking about musical terminology. And he would call, when you wanted to play in the key of A, he'd say, let's get up in that high atmosphere. And I always thought, that's such a beautiful way of talking about keys and the different voices of, whether I'm writing in a voice, I'm going to be a 14-year-old Native American girl. Or whether I'm going to say, I'm going to give this piece an atmosphere by singing it with the fiddle. Sometimes it happens right from the beginning, and sometimes it's saying, well, let's try on another suit of clothes and see what it looks like.
Sure. So in your songwriting, I mean, you've mentioned Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger as two influences. Are they influences on the songwriting part of your life as well?
Oh, Woody, certainly. Because in that book, this was a book that I thought was a guitar instruction book. I mean, that's how little I knew about Woody Guthrie. And it was, and so I thought, well, it's an instruction book, so you start in the beginning. And I went sequentially, and it took me, it took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that it was arranged alphabetically. I mean, what are the chances that all the easiest songs start with A? But what that meant, that kind of, you know, that's just how they decided to do it. It was, one page was a love song, the next was a kid's song, and then there'd be an historical song, and then a topical song, and then a funny song, and then an angry song. And it was an introduction to someone who wrote about everything for every possible audience. It wasn't weird to write kids' songs directed to kids. It wasn't weird to write a song about an historical event that you knew your listener knew nothing about. Your job was to pay attention and to try to tell the truth. And so that was huge. I mean, that was, and to have guts, to be courageous, to be willing to name things and to give something of, I mean, I remember one of the very first book, because it was alphabetical, one of the very first songs in this book was the 1913 Massacre.
Right.
And I got to this line that said, "I'll take you through a door and up a tall stair." And man, I was there. It was very, you know, a song as a movie. And I thought, that's how I want to write. I want to be that cinematic and take people inside, you know, invite them into these spaces. So yeah, Woody, the songwriters that were really powerful to me as I was starting off were Jean Ritchie, who is such a good songwriter that most people don't know she's a songwriter.
Right. They don't know that the songs were hers, right?
Yes, that, you hear a song like "Cool of the Day,"
Yeah.
and you, which she told me once that she wrote while she was ironing. And most people don't know that that's not a traditional song. Hazel Dickens, the same thing. I mean, she was thoroughly immersed in traditional music, and so her writing came out of that. And talk about a courageous writer. That song "Black Lung."
Right.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Utah Phillips, again, came out of that school of knowing, you know, about traditional music, using those forms, and having a kind of empathy and compassion that, you know, I mean, to Utah, no one was dispensable. And so, yeah, you'd finally think, why is he singing me this song about this hobo? I don't know anything. I don't know any hobos. Are there hobos anymore? And all of a sudden, you couldn't look away. And that was the kind of writing that really inspired and continues. Bernice Regan Johnson, just an astonishing songwriter.
Right.
That, again, people don't know.
Yeah.
And she came right out of the church.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's another kind of influence that you can detect in your songs, I guess, is both kind of the sacred harp side of things and the African American spiritual side. So.
Well, I grew up as a Catholic, which has the meagerest singing tradition. I was actually in the seminary for a couple of years, and when I decided I was going to leave, I told my mother, I said, "Well, I don't think I want to be a priest. I think I'd rather be the choir leader." And she said, "That's a tougher job in a Catholic church." But so when I came to a place that was, you know, there was this rich musical tradition, and it was, I could be completely misspeaking, but I think American folk music is unique, or certainly rare, in that it includes religious music in music that's considered folk music. And you know, on one hand, I would be sitting with Jeanette Carter, and she would be singing Little Moses or The Poor Orphan Child, and the next day I would be attending an old regular Baptist service with Roscoe Holcomb. And everybody somehow knows the melody of this circuitous, and someone is lining out the words. Um, and then the next day I would be at an old harp singing.
Right.
And it was all religious music, completely different stuff. And the next night I'd see Ralph Stanley and the Klitsch Mountain Boys doing "O Death" or "Children Go Where I Send Thee" or "Cry from the Cross" or, you know, "Two Coats Lay Before Me." And it was again, I think if you look at the history of political music in this country, the most powerful stuff was the music from the civil rights movement. And a lot of it was because it had the depth of not only it being traditional based, but spiritually based stuff, which gave it a kind of gravitas that, you know, newly composed stuff just wasn't approaching.
Right. Well, the other sort of great political movement bringing us songs was the labor movement, and I know you've worked with both labor songwriters and labor as a musician. So let's talk just a little bit about your projects with Cy Khan, for example.
Well, Cy, as the people who are watching this, is a rabbi's son, grew up in State College, Pennsylvania, and signed up for SNCC in the very early days of the civil rights movement. He, you know, was a guy who played guitar but wasn't writing songs, but quickly understood the kind of plain-spoken vernacular usage of people's own words. I mean, when one of the things that I recognized about Cy's music early on, this is back in the days when he denied he was writing. I mean, he would flat out lie. No, I didn't, you know, I'd be at a party with him. He said, wow, that was a great song. Where'd that come from? He says, oh, this guy down the road. and eventually I just drove down to his house in Mineral Bluff, Georgia, and I said, I want to meet this guy down the road. And he says, well, I wrote it. I said, well, why aren't you admitting it? He says, well, because everybody's into collecting stuff now, and I figured if I said I wrote it, people wouldn't take it seriously. It's sort of like J.P. Fraley, who I spent a lot of time with, and he wrote half the tunes he played, but he said, he would confide in you. He's dead now, so I can talk about it. He'd confide in you and say, well, if I told so-and-so I wrote that, they wouldn't pay any attention to it. So I'd tell them that I, you know, collected it from, or I learned it from my grandfather. But Cy is just one of the most prolific and wonderful songwriters in his spare time. We met on a Harlan County picket line on Thanksgiving Day, 1972. He was there working with the Brookside Strike, the subject of Harlan County, USA, the Barbara Koppel Academy Award-winning film. And I was there because I didn't have a Thanksgiving Day invitation, and I knew there was a strike, and I figured, okay, well, I'll go up and sing at the picket line. So I was sitting around a 55-gallon oil drum with a bunch of guys who were wanting to be back at work. And somebody said, there's a guy who's a banjo player down at the picket line, and Cy showed up. And he was working for the UMW at the time. And we recognized our mutual love of traditional music and Southern music, and struck up a partnership that exists to this day. And we started writing songs together in the early 1990s. We did a lot of work together, and we toured together in the early and mid 80s, but we were both singing our own songs at that point. We started writing together because we're guys, and we had to have an excuse to get together. We'd have to say, well, you know, yeah, we just like to hang out for a few days, but that would be weird, and we don't hunt, so why don't we get together and write songs? And we found that we worked really well together because we're compatible and complementary. Cy is wall and stud guy, and I'm the guy who comes in and does the finish work. And the way we would write is sometimes I would write a whole song, sometimes he would write a whole song. We use the Lennon and McCartney rule. Everything that, everybody knows, John, Lennon had nothing to do with Yesterday. But they both, this was an agreement. But there were times when we would say, Cy would come up with some structure and he'd say, fine, okay, you finish it. And years later he would see it on an album. I said, and it would be credited to him. He said, did I have anything to do with it? Yeah, you did. And at the time I started working with Cy, I was the kind of guy that if I wrote a song, it was like, whew, that's a good day's work. And Cy would say, great, what's next? And we got to the point where we wrote an entire album in a day and a half. Wow. And it was a good album. We got a Grammy nomination for it. But we were just in the groove. And we were, passing stuff off back and forth. And Cy would go off and take a nap, which she's really good at, and come back and be ready to go. He's the most present person I've ever met. He's just, I got to do a conference call, and he's right there, and then he hangs up, and he's right back there. He's astonishing, and he's also an endless font of fantastic ideas. I just recently started doing his song that I remember when he wrote it, called Go to Work on Monday One More Time. It was just, he was working on the J.P. Stevens boycott at the time, and he happened to, they were trying to get brown lung introduced, recognized as an occupational disease. And he just, it was a guy talking about, I'm sick. The doctor is lying to me. My boss is lying to me. Everybody knows what's wrong, and I can't do anything else. So I'm just going to have to go to work on Monday one more time. And it's, I've known that song for 40 years. And every time I sing it, and I do it with fiddle now, just give it a different voice. It's an astonishing song, and it's so affecting. And it's one of the things that fiction does. It opens us up to an experience that we would, I defy anybody not to be changed somehow by hearing this really authentic voice saying, the doctor says I smoke too much. He says that I ain't trying. He says you don't know what I got. But we both know he's a lying. I'm going to go to work on Monday one more time. And not just be in that guy's presence. Yeah. And it's a special songwriter that can do that, and Cy's that kind of songwriter. And I'm lucky enough to sort of be on the planet at the same time he is. And we're pals, and we get to write together.
Yeah. Well, there's one other pal I'd like to ask you about, because I had the pleasure of interviewing her here when she was here, and that is Carmen Agredini.
Oh, yeah, I do know her.
Carmen is John's wife.
Yes, yes, for 10 years now. Well,
it was her as an influence.
It was her birthday yesterday. I met Carmen sort of back in the mid-90s. I was doing a collection I was on the board of Grassroots Leadership, which was Cy's regional organizing organization. That was his real job. He was a great songwriter in his spare time. And I had put together a multicultural children's album of music for for 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus stumbling on the New World. And it was very successful, and I didn't know Carmen at all, and I was going to do a multicultural storytelling album to benefit the same organization. And our mutual friend Michael Parent, who was a wonderful storyteller, French-Canadian descent, said, well, here's who you should get. And I had been to the National Storytelling Festival a couple of times, I guess as sonic relief. But somebody recognized that, oh, a lot of John's songs tell stories or have introductions that are more than just sort of pedantic, or I wrote this because. And Carmen was one of the people I approached, and she agreed to be a part of this. And then once it was clear that she and I were an item, I got invited almost every year to the National Storytelling Festival. And that was where I was really in the company of workers of the word. And if you're a word nerd like I am, just to hear people use language. It was one of the things that made me fall in love with the South, just the way people would talk. I mean, people would say, I just dread Christmas, all this rushing and swarping around. Or Jeanette Carter used to say, well, that Johnny Cash just needs to get all his shit in one sock. And I just thought, well, that's a weird thing, but I know what you mean. Right. Or she was in a state of high fuss. And my exposure to the storytelling world via my relationship with Carmen, but I mean, Carmen has the best sense of story of anyone I know. In her writing, she's the hardest working writer I know. I mean, she has primarily worked in the world of children's picture books, which everybody looks at and says, it's 32 pages. How hard can that be? But she completely understands the form. She's working on a book until they tear it from her fingers to print it. I mean, she gets F and G's, the folded and gathered, the proofs, and says, oh no, I got to change that line right there. She just wants to make it perfect. She's the hardest working writer I've been around, but a great sense of story, and both the way that she tells her stories and that sense of story has really influenced my songwriting. I mean, my last album of original songs, I look at it and I thought, I couldn't have written that 10 years ago. I didn't know how to use, I mean, I understood the distillation of language that songwriting and poetry is, but to present a convincing story and not have that pebble in the shoe moment was something, I did an album of songs and stories that I recorded live at the National Storytelling Festival, and one reviewer happened to say, it's obvious that his marriage to Carmen Agredini has turned him into a first-rate storyteller.
Even better storyteller.
Yeah. Well, and I showed that to her, and she of course said, oh no, you were great before. But it's true. It's true. You can't, if you are someone who loves words and loves story and loves the world that you can create in a few minutes, you can't help but be influenced by it. I would like to think she's influenced by me, but I certainly know that I'm influenced by her.
All right. Well, I think we have to leave it there, but it was wonderful to have
thanks,
you
Steve.
here. John McCutcheon, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.